If you've ever walked through a small town at night, you may have noticed how the windows behave. Some glow faintly with the light of a single lamp, others flicker with the restless chatter of a television, and most are dark, as they should be because people are asleep. But sometimes there is that one window, the one that shines far too brightly for its own good, the one that doesn't dim, no matter how late you walk past. Now, in most cases, this means someone forgot to turn off a bulb. But in the case of our story, the townsfolk are quite convinced that such brightness can only mean one thing: magic. And so, tonight, you and I are going to wander, slowly, very slowly, toward a little glowing cottage on the edge of a quiet town. No need to hurry. We'll stroll. We'll notice the cobblestones. We'll notice the cool air. And eventually, we'll notice two men, one who fancies himself an explorer, and one who merely makes shoes, trying very hard to look as though they are not sneaking toward the cottage. Which of course they are. Settle in, breathe slowly, let curiosity keep one eye open, while the rest of you is free to drift, to sink, to rest. The cottage will wait for us, the glow will not fade, and the night, as always, is unhurried. In this little town, people had perfected the art of talking about nothing in particular. It was a talent honed over years of long evenings and short tempers, of markets where the price of onions was never as interesting as the rumor about Mrs. Pemberley's nephew, and of taverns where gossip was served alongside ale, sometimes with more spice. The greatest subject of talk, however, was not onions, nor nephews, nor ale. It was a cottage. A small, crooked cottage that by day could hardly be noticed at all. But by night, well, by night it was impossible to ignore. Its windows glowed as if the very stars had come inside to rent the rooms. Its chimney shimmered faintly, even when there was no smoke. The door seemed outlined in a quiet golden light, as if the hinges themselves had been kissed by the sun. And so, in the absence of sensible explanations, the villagers turned to their favorite pastime: speculation. They say the cottage was built over a well that leads straight to the heavens, whispered one baker rolling dough at dawn. They say it's guarded by spirits, answered a tailor, who hadn't seen a spirit in her life but rather liked the idea. They say it's no different from any other cottage, mumbled an old man at the tavern, though he said it in a tone that suggested he didn't even believe himself. By daylight the cottage was almost a disappointment. It leaned slightly to the left, as though tired from holding itself upright. Its roof was patchy, its walls were chipped, the paint had long ago surrendered to the weather. The path leading to its door was more weeds than stone. If one were to pass it in the morning, one might have shrugged and thought, A fine enough place to keep chickens perhaps, but nothing to lose sleep over. And yet by sunset, the same passerby would have stopped, turned, stared, and wondered what on earth, or perhaps not on earth at all, could possibly cause such a glow. No candles could burn so bright, the townsfolk reasoned. No lanterns could pour light from every window with such steady brilliance. And no family, no matter how devoted to evening hobbies, could reasonably justify keeping their lights on from dusk until dawn, every single night of the year. It was strange. Too strange to ignore. And so the whispers continued, multiplying with every market day, every evening stroll, every cup of tea. Among those who listened were two men, a shoemaker and an explorer. The shoemaker was a practical man. He made shoes that fit well, lasted long, and pinched only in places where no one would admit it. He had no patience for fairy tales, though he did have a quiet admiration for a well-lit workspace. To him, the glowing cottage was not frightening, it was convenient. Imagine, he thought, how many stitches one could see by such a light. The explorer was of a different mind. He was restless, curious, and rather too fond of declaring that he had once camped on a mountaintop that most people had only ever seen on maps. He collected rumors the way some men collect coins, storing them away with the quiet certainty that one day they would lead him somewhere remarkable. And so, to him, the glowing cottage was not convenient. It was irresistible. When the shoemaker mentioned, in passing, that someone really ought to look inside and find out what was what, the explorer seized the idea as though it were treasure. He insisted they must go. Not in daylight, of course, that would spoil the mystery. But at night, when the glow was at its strongest and the town was asleep, and the two of them could sneak down the cobbled street, pretending very hard not to be nervous. And so, with little more than curiosity in their pockets and a remarkable lack of foresight, the shoemaker and the explorer set their plan in motion. The whispers of the town had finally found volunteers. The shoemaker was, above all things, sensible. His work was measured, practical, steady. He dealt in leather and thread, in soles and heels, in buckles and laces. He liked things he could see, things he could hold, things that, after a bit of hammering, would reliably stay put. When he looked at the glowing cottage, he thought not of enchantments or celestial mysteries. He thought of candle savings. He thought of better visibility for his stitching. He thought, perhaps, of opening a second shop, one that came with its own eternal light supply. The explorer, on the other hand, was cut from fabric of a more flamboyant weave. If the shoemaker was leather and thread, the explorer was parchment and ink. Maps crammed his study, his satchel, his dreams. He lived in a state of constant half-truths, not because he meant to deceive, but because his imagination ran so far ahead of reality that it tripped over it regularly. If he said he had once shared a drink with a sultan, it was probably only half false. Perhaps it had been a merchant, not a sultan. And perhaps the drink had been weak tea, not rare wine. But to the explorer the difference was merely technical. Life was a story, and he was determined to make it worth retelling. So while the shoemaker eyed the glowing cottage with a kind of practical curiosity, the explorer gazed at it with hunger, the sort of hunger only mysteries could satisfy. The two men, though different in almost every respect, found themselves thrown together often. The shoemaker, after all, repaired the explorer's boots. Boots that wore out with suspicious regularity, considering how many of the explorer's travels seemed to take place entirely in his imagination. And the explorer, in turn, brought the shoemaker stories, half-wild tales of mountains and rivers, of ships and storms, though he rarely paid for the repairs on time. One evening, as they sat side by side on a crooked bench outside the shoemaker's workshop, the explorer began in his usual way to prod. "Have you never wondered," he said, lowering his voice, "what lies inside that cottage?" The shoemaker shrugged. "Shelves, a chair or two, perhaps a kettle. What else could it be?" The explorer leaned forward. "Ah, but what if it is not shelves? What if it is worlds? Whole worlds, stacked behind those walls like books in a library?" The shoemaker frowned. If it were worlds, who would pay the rent? This was the difference between them. The shoemaker wanted facts, the explorer wanted fables. And yet between the two of them a strange sort of balance existed. Too much practicality made life dull. Too much imagination made life unlivable. Together, they tilted just enough towards sense, and just enough toward nonsense, to entertain one another endlessly. And so, after several more evenings of such conversations, the explorer's insistence wore down the shoemaker's resistance. The shoemaker agreed, reluctantly, and with the air of a man who suspected this was a very poor idea, that they ought to investigate the glowing cottage. Plans, as far as the explorer was concerned, were overrated. He had, in fact, misplaced most of his plans years ago, somewhere between the desert crossing that never happened, and the mountain climb that had stopped at the gift shop. But this time, even he agreed, they ought to be cautious. The shoemaker, for his part, insisted on practicalities. They would go at night. They would wear quiet shoes. They would bring a lantern, though, as the shoemaker pointed out, the cottage seemed to have more than enough light already. "Should we bring bread?" asked the explorer. "For what?" asked the shoemaker. "In case we get lost," said the explorer. "Hansel and Gretel, you know." "We're going to a cottage, not a forest," said the shoemaker. The explorer nodded solemnly. "Yes, but one never knows." And so, armed with little more than determination, mismatched expectations, and a lantern they almost certainly would not need, the shoemaker and the explorer made their decision. They would wait for nightfall. They would slip quietly through the streets of the sleeping town, and they would open the glowing door. What they expected to find, kettles or kingdoms, chairs or worlds, remained a matter of disagreement. But one thing was certain: neither of them, not even the practical shoemaker, could entirely silence the quickening beat of curiosity. The day passed slowly, as days always seem to do when you are waiting for something you're not entirely sure you want to happen. The shoemaker worked at his bench, stitching leather with steady hands, but his mind wandered, wandering again and again to the glowing cottage. The explorer spent the afternoon fussing with maps. Not maps of the town, of course, but maps of distant mountains and forgotten seas. Maps that were of no use at all for what lay ahead. But they made him feel prepared, which was almost the same thing. And so the hours drifted on. Shadows lengthened. Candles were lit in the town windows. And one by one, those candles went out again, until only the glow of the cottage remained, standing quietly at the edge of everything, patient, steady, and impossible to ignore. When the shoemaker finally stepped outside, the air was cool, the kind of cool that carried the smell of damp earth, and chimney smoke, and the faint sweetness of grass. The explorer was already waiting by the fountain in the square, looking far too excited for a man who was meant to be sneaking about. They set off together slowly. Not because they were trying to be cautious, but because, if they walked too quickly, it would mean they were eager, and being eager would mean they might actually reach the cottage. And reaching the cottage was rather more serious than simply talking about it. Their footsteps echoed on the cobblestones, a soft tap, 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 that sounded far louder than it had any right to in the sleeping town. Every time a dog barked or an owl shifted in the rafters, they froze perfectly still, as if they had been caught, though no one was there to catch them. And yet, step by step, the cottage grew closer. From a distance, the glow was like a lantern, like the moon caught in glass, but as they drew nearer it became something more, a soft radiance that seemed to move through the air itself. The shoemaker squinted, trying to make sense of it, as though squinting had ever helped anyone solve a magical mystery. The explorer whispered, too loudly, that it was clearly a sign of other worlds. The shoemaker whispered back, just as loudly, that it was probably bad insulation. They disagreed, they bickered, but all the while, they walked. And at last, there it was. The cottage. So close that the shoemaker could see the uneven thatch of the roof. So close the explorer could see his own reflection in the bright window pane. They stood at the edge of the path, the glow painting their faces in soft gold. Neither of them moving. Neither of them speaking. Listening only to the sound of their own hearts, which had the nerve to beat far too quickly for such a calm, quiet night. The shoemaker exhaled. The explorer grinned. And together they took one step closer toward the door that waited. The cottage stood quietly at the edge of the lane, as though it had been waiting all this time. Not hurried, not eager, just waiting. From afar, the glow had been only a suggestion, but here, standing so close, it was something else entirely. It was as though the walls themselves were gently breathing with light. Every wooden beam, every crooked stone, every stubborn piece of ivy, seemed to be lined with a soft golden outline, as though a careful hand had traced it with sunlight. The shoemaker rubbed his eyes, not because he was tired, though he certainly was, but because his mind insisted that no building should look like this. Buildings were meant to sag and slump and behave like ordinary buildings, not to glow as though they had swallowed the day and forgotten to let it out again. The explorer, meanwhile, was entranced. He pressed his face much too close to one of the windows, ignoring the smudges it left on the glass. He muttered observations to himself in the tone of a man writing a great scientific paper, though he was really just repeating words like remarkable, extraordinary, entirely unprecedented. The shoemaker tugged him back, muttering something about fingerprints and respect for property. But even he, for all his practical fussing, could not help but stare. For here, right before them, was the thing that had filled every whisper of the town. Not a rumor now, not a story, but a real cottage, humming faintly with impossible light. The path leading to the door was uneven, mostly weeds, though here and there a few flat stones still held their place, sunk deep into the earth as though reluctant to move. The shoemaker stepped carefully, muttering about twisted ankles. The explorer strode boldly, pretending not to notice he nearly tripped on the second stone. The door itself was plain enough. Wood, aged and weathered, with a latch that looked no sturdier than any latch in town. And yet, it too glowed. Not brightly, not like the windows, but faintly, along the edges, as though light was seeping through from the other side. The shoemaker bent close, running his fingers just above the wood. He expected warmth perhaps, or the faint buzz of some electrical trick, though of course there was no electricity in this sleepy little town. Instead, there was only coolness. The door was cool, the kind of cool that comes from old wood left too long in shade. The explorer whispered that he could hear something beyond, something like music, though it may have only been the crickets in the grass. The shoemaker rolled his eyes, but he leaned closer too, listening to the silence. And in that silence, perhaps there was a hum. Not loud, not clear, just present. A hum like a breath being held. The windows shone brightest of all, glowing rectangles against the dark of night. They were not uniform in size, one slightly taller, one set a little crooked, as though the builder had decided precision was optional. But each was filled with the same steady light, no flicker, no dimming, no sign of flame. The shoemaker shaded his eyes, peering in, but saw nothing except brightness itself, thick and impenetrable, like trying to look through the heart of a lantern. It was impossible to tell what lay inside. The explorer pressed his nose to the glass again. He was very fond of pressing his nose to things, and announced that the glow had layers. The shoemaker said this was nonsense. The explorer replied that nonsense was only sense in disguise. And so they argued quietly, there at the window bathed in gold. But even as they quibbled, neither man stepped back. The shoemaker's practical mind wanted an answer. The explorer's restless spirit wanted a revelation. And both of them stood caught between hesitation and wonder, while the cottage kept glowing as though it had never known darkness. For a long time, longer than they meant to, they lingered outside, staring at the crooked roofline, the golden frames, the quiet hum of light, until finally, the explorer's hand drifted toward the latch. The shoemaker sighed, very softly, and did not stop him. The explorer's hand lingered on the latch. Fingers curled lightly, not pulling, not pushing, just resting there, as though testing whether the wood would object. The shoemaker shifted his weight from one foot to the other, muttering under his breath that doors were made to be opened, not stared at. And yet, neither of them moved for quite some time. The latch was ordinary. The hinges were ordinary. But the air around them was not. It carried the faint scent of something unfamiliar. Not flowers, not wood smoke, not the earth they knew, but something brighter, sharper, as though the glow itself had a fragrance. Finally, slowly, the explorer pressed down. The latch clicked. A simple, small sound. And then, as the door creaked open, the golden light spilled outward in a soft wave, gentle, steady, and strangely inviting. They both squinted, not against harshness but against brilliance, as though they had stepped too close to the edge of a dream. And together, without a word, they crossed the threshold. The first step inside was like stepping into warmth, not heat, not fire, but the warmth of sunlight caught in cloth and released again slowly. The walls glowed softly, as though the light came from within the plaster itself. The floorboards shimmered faintly, grain of the wood outlined in pale gold. Even the air seemed touched by radiance, drifting lazily, as though dust motes had learned how to shine. And yet, despite the brilliance, it was not blinding. It was calm, soothing, the kind of light that filled every corner, every shadow, and yet never demanded squinting, never demanded attention. It was simply there, as natural as breathing. The shoemaker stepped carefully, testing the floorboards, half expecting them to vanish beneath his boots. But they held, solid and ordinary, beneath the extraordinary glow. The explorer wandered further, tilting his head this way and that, as though cataloguing every angle of the impossible. There was little furniture. A table in the corner. A chair that leaned against it, not entirely upright. And on the far wall, 2 doors. Plain, wooden, simple, yet outlined in light so strong they seemed to hum. For a long while, neither man spoke. The explorer, who was rarely quiet, seemed caught in reverence, as though afraid his voice might shatter something delicate. The shoemaker, who usually had much to mutter about, found his words dissolving before they reached his tongue. The silence of the cottage was not empty. It was full. Full of hums too quiet to name. Full of stillness too heavy to break. Full of light that seemed almost alive. They looked at the 2 doors. Just 2. Side by side, waiting. Unremarkable in their shape, their handles, their frames. And yet unmistakably remarkable, because they were the only things in the room that seemed to promise more than the room itself. The shoemaker rubbed his palms together, practical habit in the face of impractical wonder. The explorer inhaled deeply, as though breathing in the air of a new continent. And still, they waited. Standing in the golden glow, letting the calm soak into them, feeling time itself stretch as though the moment might last forever. At last the explorer whispered, "Which door first?" And the shoemaker, though he had no answer, found himself smiling, just faintly, at the ridiculousness of it all. The shoemaker and the explorer stood side by side, the faint golden glow of the cottage wrapping around them like a patient blanket, and before them, against the far wall, were the doors. 2 of them. Not 3. Not 4. Just 2. At first glance there was nothing extraordinary about them. Wooden panels. Plain frames. Simple brass handles that had dulled with time, as brass always does. No carvings, no ornaments, nothing to mark them as magical or mysterious. And yet, the longer the men looked, the less ordinary the doors became. Each one seemed to pulse faintly with light, as though a candle, or perhaps a sun, were burning just on the other side. It was not the uneven flicker of fire, but the steady, patient glow of something larger, something endless, something that did not run out. The shoemaker squinted, uncertain whether it was his eyes playing tricks. The explorer tilted his head, as though a different angle might reveal a secret. Between the doors the wall was bare, plain white, unremarkable, unlit. And so, in this otherwise empty room, the two doors demanded attention. They stood there like choices, like questions, like paths waiting to be walked. The shoemaker rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly very aware of how small the room seemed. The explorer, meanwhile, leaned forward until his nose was unreasonably close to the left-hand handle, muttering to himself about destiny and design. Neither man touched the doors. Not yet, but already. Both could feel the pull of them. It is worth saying that the two doors were not identical, not quite. The left-hand door had a faint curve in its wood grain, a subtle ripple that caught the golden glow and bent it softly, as though the door itself were sighing. Its brass handle was smoother, shinier, as if it had been polished by hands that never grew tired. Standing before it, the shoemaker felt a strange sense of calm, as though this door had been waiting for him, specifically, for longer than he had been alive. The right-hand door was different. Its wood was straighter, darker, the glow seeping around its frame in sharper lines. The handle bore tiny scratches, almost invisible, but enough to suggest use repeated, persistent, restless. And standing before this door, the explorer felt something stir, a hum that matched the quick beat of his own heart. As though the door was impatient, eager, a threshold that longed to be crossed. The shoemaker cleared his throat, trying to dismiss the sensation. Doors were doors. They led somewhere, they closed behind you, they creaked when neglected. But deep down beneath his sensible thoughts, he knew this was no ordinary set of hinges and panels. The explorer, of course, had no such hesitation. He was already half convinced the doors would lead to other worlds, parallel universes, places where clocks ticked backward, and rivers ran with starlight. Two doors, side by side, each one waiting. Time did not move the same way in that glowing cottage. Perhaps minutes passed. Perhaps hours. Neither the shoemaker nor the explorer could tell. The silence stretched, calm, heavy, unbroken, except for the faint hum of the light that surrounded everything. The shoemaker shifted his boots, the sound of leather against wood startlingly loud in the stillness. He folded his arms, unfolded them, folded them again. Finally, he said, in a voice that wavered between curiosity and reluctance, "Well then, which one?" The explorer beamed, delighted to be asked. "Both," he said immediately, though how one might step through both doors at once was not entirely clear. The shoemaker muttered that explorers never did think practically, but his eyes did not leave the doors. He found himself wondering not just what lay behind them, but whether, once opened, they could ever be closed again. The glow from the doors seemed stronger now, as though the doors themselves were aware of being watched. It filled the room with a gentle warmth, not uncomfortable but insistent, like standing near the hearth and realizing the fire is meant for you. The shoemaker and the explorer exchanged a glance, one cautious, one eager, and though no words were spoken, the decision was made. They would open one. Not both, not yet, but one. The cottage waited. The doors waited. And the men, hearts unsteady, prepared to choose. The explorer reached first. Of course he did. His hand hovering above the left-hand handle as though even the air around it carried some secret. The shoemaker stayed back, arms crossed tightly, trying to look unimpressed, though his eyes betrayed him, fixed on the glowing outline that spilled so steadily from the frame. For a long while the explorer did not touch it. He simply hovered there, fingers trembling just slightly, as if waiting for the door itself to breathe. And in the silence it almost felt as though it did, the faint hum deepening, the glow thickening, until the shoemaker muttered under his breath, "Well, are you going to open it, or simply stand there making faces?" The explorer smiled faintly, as though the shoemaker's impatience had been exactly the permission he needed. And then, slowly, so slowly, he curled his fingers around the cool brass handle. It was smoother than expected, almost soft beneath the touch, though still unmistakably metal. He pressed downward. The latch gave with a quiet click. The wood shifted with the gentlest of groans. And a sliver of light poured through, brighter than the glow of the cottage itself. It widened, inch by inch, as the door swung open, releasing a breath of air that did not belong to the world they knew. The air was sweet, cool, carrying the faintest trace of flowers that did not grow in any garden the shoemaker had ever tended. And beyond the threshold there was not darkness, not shadow, not even another room, but an entire horizon. They stepped through, hesitant at first, then with greater certainty, as the ground beneath their feet proved steady and real. And when their eyes adjusted to the glow, they found themselves standing in a garden unlike any they had ever known. The grass was soft, impossibly soft, each blade glowing faintly at its edges, as though it had swallowed starlight. Flowers grew in clusters of colors that had no names, hues between blue and silver, between crimson and dawn, shades that seemed to shimmer with every slow breath of wind. Some petals were translucent, thin as glass, others, thick and velvety, trembling gently as though they were listening. Above them the sky stretched wide and endless, but it was not the sky they knew. Its color was shifting, fluid, moving like water in slow currents. At times it seemed green, then violet, then a pale golden wash, as though dawn and dusk had decided to share the same canvas forever. The shoemaker knelt, running his hand over the glowing grass, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's not natural," he muttered, though there was no anger in his tone, only awe. The explorer, meanwhile, was already wandering toward a cluster of silver-leafed trees, his laughter light and unsteady, as though he had just stumbled upon a secret that had been meant for him alone. There was no sound of birds, no hum of insects, only the quiet rustling of leaves that seemed to carry music without melody. A silence that was not empty but rich, layered, as though the world itself were humming, too low for ordinary ears to hear. The longer they stayed, the stranger the air felt. Not unpleasant, never unpleasant, but different. Each breath seemed to stretch out, as though it lasted a little longer than it should. Each blink of the eye seemed to linger, as though the eyelids had forgotten how to hurry. Time here was not ticking, it was flowing, slow, patient, without measure. The shoemaker glanced at his hands, convinced for a moment that the lines of his palms had shifted, though when he looked again they were the same as before. The explorer, on the other hand, seemed unconcerned. He tilted his face to the strange sky, and sighed as though he had been waiting his entire life to breathe this very air. They walked a little further, their footsteps soft on the glowing grass. They passed trees whose trunks shimmered faintly, as though veins of light ran just beneath their bark. They brushed past flowers that closed and opened in slow rhythm, like lungs inhaling and exhaling. And all the while the sense of time stretched, thinned, almost disappeared, until the shoemaker was no longer sure whether they had been there minutes or hours. Finally, they stopped at the edge of a quiet pool, its surface like glass, reflecting not the sky above but another sky altogether, one that shimmered with stars and constellations neither man recognized. The shoemaker crouched, frowning at the impossibility. The explorer simply smiled. "Magic," he whispered. And for once, the shoemaker did not argue. Eventually, after what felt like both a moment and an eternity, the two men turned back toward the door. The explorer looked reluctant, glancing over his shoulder at the shimmering trees, as though leaving them behind was an unforgivable mistake. The shoemaker, however, walked a little faster, muttering something about too much enchantment in the lungs not being good for a man. The threshold still stood there, open, steady, glowing with the patient light of the cottage on the other side. It did not close of its own accord. It did not fade, or flicker, or try to hold them. It simply waited. Crossing back was like stepping out of a dream that had been stitched directly onto reality. One moment the men were surrounded by luminous grass, and the next, their boots were upon the wooden floor of the cottage once more, the silence pressing close, the walls plain and bare. It felt smaller now, ordinary, compared to the world they had just seen. The shoemaker rubbed his temples, as though he had left part of his mind behind among the silver trees. The explorer, meanwhile, gave the right-hand door a look that could only be described as hungry. The right-hand door was different from the start. Where the left-hand door had opened with a sigh, this one opened with a sound more like a sharp inhale. The glow that spilled out was cooler, paler, almost silver rather than gold. It spread across the floor in long, cold lines, as though even light had learned discipline. The explorer grasped the handle without hesitation. Of course he did, and turned it with a smooth, decisive twist. The shoemaker groaned softly, muttering about reckless hands, but stepped closer all the same. When the door opened, the air that met them was crisp and dry, tinged with a faint metallic tang, as though the very sky beyond had been forged rather than grown. And then, they saw it. Where the first door had revealed a garden, this one revealed something altogether different. A landscape vast and bare, yet somehow shimmering with its own beauty. The horizon stretched flat and endless, a great plain of silver dust that glittered faintly beneath a dark sky. The shoemaker froze. The explorer grinned. They stepped through together this time, neither man willing to let the other vanish into a second universe without him. The ground was solid beneath their boots, yet soft enough to leave gentle impressions that seemed to fade as quickly as they appeared. Each step released a faint shimmer, as though the dust itself were light pretending to be earth. Above them, the sky was darker than any night they had known, yet not frightening. It was velvet black, scattered with stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the air like fruit. And the stars, they did not twinkle. They burned steady and still, sharp points of light that watched in silence. There was no breeze here, no rustle of leaves, no hum of insects. The silence was complete, so complete that the shoemaker felt the sound of his own breathing as a weight upon the air. The explorer, naturally, called it peaceful. The shoemaker muttered that it felt like standing inside a clock that had stopped ticking. As they walked, they noticed strange shapes rising from the horizon. Towers of crystal, jagged and tall, shimmering with faint light as though they had been carved by some patient, invisible hand. They caught the faint silver glow of the dust and returned it in soft flashes, like mirrors that had forgotten to be exact. The shoemaker stared, bewildered. The explorer whispered almost reverently, "Another world." And indeed it was. Not lush, not warm, not welcoming in the way of the glowing garden, but vast, silent, strange, beautiful in its stillness. The shoemaker and the explorer moved carefully across the vast plain, their boots pressing into the fine dust, each step sending up the faintest shimmer before settling again into silence. There was no echo of their movement, no sound of crunching or scattering, only the strange hush of a place that seemed unwilling to acknowledge noise. Every now and then the shoemaker would stop, glance behind, and frown at the trail they left. A moment later, the prints would soften, blur and vanish, as though the ground itself disliked being marked. He muttered under his breath, something about a land too tidy for its own good. The explorer, meanwhile, was delighted, pointing out every detail as though he'd discovered them personally. The way the silver grains caught the starlight, the way the crystal towers seemed to hum without sound, the way his own shadow stretched farther than seemed proper. Above them, the stars remained fixed, sharp and bright, unmoving. The shoemaker tried to find a constellation he knew, but the sky refused him. Nothing there belonged to his memory. The explorer, on the other hand, claimed he recognized a pattern that resembled a shoemaker's hammer, which did not amuse the shoemaker in the slightest. They walked slowly, as though even their legs had begun to understand that rushing was unwelcome here. Each step seemed to take longer than it should. Each breath seemed to linger in their lungs before leaving again. Time stretched thin, thinner still, until it felt like they were being drawn along with it, caught in its deliberate slowness. The towers rose higher the closer they came, not spires exactly, but jagged pillars that thrust upward in uneven angles, as though the earth had been frozen in the middle of growing. Some leaned, some cracked halfway to the top, yet none had fallen. They stood in a silent cluster, a forest of stone and light, reaching toward the unmoving stars. The shoemaker touched one, cautiously, his hand hovering an inch above the surface before finally pressing against the smooth face. It was cool. So cool it was almost warm again, an impossible chill that seemed to soak into his skin without discomfort. The surface reflected him faintly, though the image was blurred, dreamlike, as if the tower refused to remember faces properly. The explorer pressed both palms against another tower, and leaned his forehead there, grinning like a man who had found a secret library. "Listen," he whispered. The shoemaker, naturally, said there was nothing to listen to. But as he stood there, unwilling to admit curiosity, he realized there was a vibration, faint, so faint, not sound exactly, but a hum that could be felt rather than heard. It was steady, patient, endless, like the ticking of a clock without hands. They moved between the towers slowly, as though walking through a hall of ancient bells that had forgotten how to ring. The shoemaker shivered. The explorer laughed softly. Both men were silent for a long while afterward. It was only when they finally sat, on a low ridge of silver dust, leaning against one of the crystal pillars, that the shoemaker noticed something truly odd. His hands. The lines on his palms seemed deeper now, sharper. Not older exactly, but as though they had been waiting for years to show themselves. His boots, too, felt heavier, as though they had walked 100 miles more than they truly had. The explorer, by contrast, seemed untouched, cheeks flushed, eyes alight, as restless as ever. The shoemaker grumbled about unfairness, then grew quiet as he realized the explorer's shadow had lengthened unnaturally, stretching far out across the silver plain in a way that made no earthly sense. Here, time was not gone. It was not absent. But it was different. Stranger. It seemed to slip sideways instead of forward, to fold in on itself, rather than stretch out straight. The shoemaker felt it in his bones. The explorer felt it in his grin. Neither man spoke of it directly. They simply sat in the silence, staring at the endless sky, and let the weight of time settle around them. The shoemaker was the first to rise. He dusted his boots, though the silver grains clung stubbornly, as though they had grown fond of him. With a quiet sigh, he turned toward the glowing frame of the right-hand door. The explorer hesitated, one last greedy glance at the towers, one last hopeful thought that perhaps they could stay just a moment longer. But even he knew, a door is not meant to remain open forever. They stepped back across the threshold. The glow of the cottage wrapped around them once more, warm, golden, familiar. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath their boots, and the plain white walls seemed to lean inward, smaller than ever after the vastness they had just walked through. The shoemaker exhaled, long and heavy, as though he had been holding his breath for hours. The explorer laughed softly, rubbing his hands together as though he had pocketed a secret. Behind them, the door closed with the faintest whisper. And just like that, the silver plain was gone. It took them a moment to notice it. At first, the cottage seemed unchanged. The same golden glow. The same silence. The same two doors, standing side by side, now quietly closed. But something in the air was different. The shoemaker frowned, rubbing his wrists, uncertain why they felt heavier. The explorer tilted his head, noticing that the light seemed slightly dimmer, as though the glow itself had grown tired. And then there was the table. A plain wooden table, which neither of them remembered seeing before. It sat neatly in the corner, as though it had always been there. The shoemaker muttered that he must have overlooked it earlier, but his voice was uncertain, because he knew he had not. The air itself felt older. The dust on the beams above looked thicker. The silence felt deeper. And the men exchanged a glance, each reluctant to say aloud what they both felt. That while only minutes seemed to have passed for them, far more had shifted here. Finally, they moved toward the cottage door, the ordinary one, the one that led back to their village, their fields, their lives. The shoemaker gripped the latch carefully, as though expecting it to resist. It did not. The door opened easily, the golden glow spilling out into the night beyond. But the night was not the same. The air was cooler. The trees beyond the cottage seemed taller, their branches heavier with leaves. The path outside looked less trodden, as though seasons had passed without footsteps. Even the stars above seemed to have rearranged themselves, not wildly, but subtly enough that the shoemaker felt an ache in his chest. They stepped outside slowly. The village lights, faint in the distance, seemed oddly placed, as though new roofs had risen, old ones had fallen. The explorer grinned, whispering something about proof and parallel clocks. The shoemaker only sighed. Whatever had happened beyond those doors had not stayed behind them. The path that once seemed short now stretched strangely long. The shoemaker and the explorer walked side by side in silence, their boots brushing against weeds that had grown taller, wilder, as though no one had tended this road in some time. The moon hung lower, heavier, its pale light spread thin across the fields. Crickets sang, but not quite the same tune as before. Even their chorus had shifted, slow and unfamiliar, as though they had learned a new rhythm while the men were away. The shoemaker kept glancing at the village in the distance. The rooftops looked different, not entirely unrecognizable, but altered, as though someone had quietly rearranged them when no one was watching. Chimneys stood where he did not recall chimneys being. Shutters had been painted colors he could not remember agreeing to. The explorer, meanwhile, seemed utterly delighted, pointing out each difference with glee, as though it were evidence of treasure rather than the unsettling passage of unseen years. Maybe, the shoemaker muttered. "We've simply taken the long way around." But his tone betrayed him. He knew better. When they finally reached the first row of cottages, the change was undeniable. Fences leaned in different directions. Gardens bloomed with plants the shoemaker did not recognize, though their neat rows suggested careful tending. Even the dogs that padded lazily by were not the same ones he remembered. They were younger, or older, or simply unfamiliar, wagging their tails as if greeting strangers. And then the people. They turned, one by one, as the shoemaker and explorer entered the square. Faces lit by lantern glow looked puzzled at first, then cautious, then wide with astonishment. A child whispered something to her mother, tugging at her sleeve. An old man stepped forward, his voice trembling as he asked, "Where have you been?" The shoemaker opened his mouth, closed it again, rubbed the back of his neck. The explorer, naturally, bowed dramatically, as though returning from a grand performance. "We've only just left," he declared. But the silence that followed made clear this was not what the villagers believed. The villagers gathered quickly, their voices hushed, but urgent, rising like the tide. Some whispered that the men had been gone for days. Others insisted it had been weeks. One woman swore she had seen them enter the glowing cottage many moons ago, and had long since assumed they would never return. The shoemaker's stomach turned at the words. The explorer, on the other hand, only looked pleased, as though every new rumor confirmed his theories. Questions pressed in on them. "What did you see? Where have you been? Was it dangerous? Was it holy? Was it cursed?" The shoemaker shifted uneasily, unwilling to fan the flames of superstition. He muttered that it was nothing much at all, just an odd room, just a trick of the light. But the explorer's grin gave him away. And though neither man offered the truth in full, the villagers could sense it. That something had been touched, something beyond their fields and fences. The murmurs grew into stories. Stories grew into suspicions. And soon enough, the cottage was no longer just the glowing house on the hill. It was the place where time slipped, where two men vanished and returned unchanged, while the world around them aged. At first, it was only murmurs. The shoemaker heard them when he fetched water at dawn. Whispers at the well, voices lowered but not low enough. They were gone for weeks, one woman said. Months, another insisted. The shoemaker clenched his jaw, staring into the rippling water, letting their words pass over him like wind. The explorer, of course, basked in it. Every sideways glance, every half-hidden smile, every startled gasp when he walked into the square, he wore them all like medals. When asked directly, he never answered with certainty, only with a shrug, a chuckle, or the maddening words, "Perhaps the cottage keeps its own calendar." And so the rumor grew. Some swore the men had been away for a season. Others whispered it had been years. The shoemaker tried to deny it, but each time he did, the denials only seemed to deepen the mystery. It did not take long for the whispers to gather shape, the way mist gathers into clouds. The glowing cottage was no longer merely odd, it was enchanted. The shoemaker and the explorer were no longer ordinary men. They were chosen. And the two doors inside? Well, no two villagers told it the same way. Some said the doors led to heaven and hell. Others claimed one opened into the past, and the other into the future. Still others swore the men had not returned at all, that the shoemaker and the explorer were ghosts wearing the shapes of the men they had once been. The shoemaker groaned each time he heard a new version. The explorer encouraged it, of course, dropping vague phrases into conversation, little fragments that could be twisted into whatever story the listener most wanted to hear. It was, he argued, far more entertaining than the truth. By the end of the month, the story had spread beyond the town. Strangers arrived on the road, eager to glimpse the glowing windows for themselves. Some came at dusk, waiting with wide eyes for the first flare of golden light. Others came at midnight, standing quietly at the edge of the field, as though the very glow might whisper secrets if only they stayed long enough. Children dared each other to run up to the cottage door and knock, though none ever claimed to hear an answer. Farmers crossed themselves when passing by. And the shoemaker, who only wanted to return to mending soles and stitching leather, found himself the unwilling keeper of a legend. The explorer, naturally, was delighted. He said the cottage had given them a gift, not just the worlds they had seen, but the story itself. The shoemaker muttered that stories did not pay for bread. But even he could not deny it now. The glowing cottage on the hill was no longer just a house. It was a legend. And they, whether they liked it or not, were part of it. It was not long before the explorer suggested going back. Of course he did. He brought it up over supper, in the middle of chewing bread, as though it were no more extraordinary than fetching water from the well. The shoemaker nearly choked on his stew. But the suggestion did not go away. For weeks it hovered between them. The explorer, restless, pacing, glancing toward the hill with longing in his eyes. The shoemaker, weary, shaking his head, muttering that some doors are best left unopened. And yet, one evening, as the sun sank and the village lanterns began to glow, they found themselves walking the road together once more. The path was quiet, the air cool, the cottage ahead waiting as it always had, glowing softly, as though nothing at all had changed. Inside, the air was still golden. The walls were still plain. The two doors still stood side by side, patient and silent, as if they had never been touched. The shoemaker lingered by the threshold, staring hard at the ordinary floorboards, as though hoping they might offer a sensible excuse to leave. The explorer stepped forward eagerly, only to pause for once before the left-hand door. His hand hovered, then dropped to his side. He looked back at the shoemaker, and in a voice softer than his usual grin suggested, he said, "Perhaps it's enough that we know." The shoemaker blinked, surprised by the restraint. Then, slowly, he nodded. And together, without opening either door, they turned back toward the cottage entrance. Outside, the night was deep and calm. The village lights glimmered faintly in the distance, steady and familiar. Behind them the cottage glowed as it always had, windows spilling soft golden light into the fields. It would go on glowing, the shoemaker realized, whether they entered again or not. It would keep its secrets, its gardens, its silver plains, its strange and bending time. And perhaps that was enough. The explorer chuckled softly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Let them wonder," he said. The shoemaker smiled faintly, shaking his head, but for once he did not argue. They walked back toward the village at an easy pace, boots tapping gently against the quiet road, their shadows stretching long under the patient stars. And behind them, the cottage waited. Not menacing, not urgent, just glowing, as it always had, and always would. And so, the story comes to rest. The cottage still glows upon the hill, steady, patient, never rushing, never dimming. The shoemaker has returned to his stitching, quietly bending over leather and thread, while the explorer still tells his half-answers, his winks, his shrugs, both men moving gently through their days, while the village carries on with its whispers and wonder. But the cottage remains, always glowing, always waiting, a soft golden beacon, not demanding, not intruding, simply there, like a lantern on the edge of a dream. You might picture it now, those windows spilling their calm golden light, the doors inside standing quietly, side by side, leading into worlds that bend and shimmer, yet staying closed for tonight. And perhaps you feel yourself drifting closer to that glow, not to enter, not to explore, only to rest beside it, basking in the hush, in the warmth, in the endless patience of the light. The night stretches on, calm and wide, the stars above steady in their watch, your breathing soft and slow, the glow of the cottage a gentle reminder that wonder can wait until morning. So let your thoughts dim now, like lamps gently turned down. Let your body sink into stillness, like a field settling under moonlight. And let sleep, calm, quiet sleep, find you, and hold you, and keep you, long after the glowing cottage fades from view.